Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor didn't leave Royal Lodge during the day. There were no photographers, no statement, no composed farewell on the steps of the 30-room mansion he fought so hard to keep. He left in the middle of the night. 1 month he was still defying pressure to move. Weeks later he was driven away under darkness, like someone who knew the cameras couldn't see this part. But the real story isn't that he moved. It's what happened during his first week at Wood Farm, the grocery deliveries, the corgis, the stunned locals, and the one decision King Charles made that Andrew could not fight back against, no matter how hard he tried. Because this wasn't downsizing, this was removal, and what it signals about his future inside the royal circle might be far more permanent than anyone expected. Subscribe now, because this story isn't slowing down, and the next developments could change everything again. Royal Lodge had 30 rooms, sweeping grounds, and the kind of presence that quietly reminded everyone who lived there. Wood Farm has 5 bedrooms and sits deep in Norfolk countryside, surrounded by marshland and long stretches of wind-cut fields. That contrast isn't just about size, it's about status. Royal Lodge was visible, Wood Farm is tucked away. And that difference sends a message. Wood Farm isn't random. It's where Philip chose to spend his final years after stepping back from public duties. It was a place of retreat, somewhere to live quietly, away from ceremony and cameras. Moving Andrew there feels deliberate. It places him in a setting historically tied to stepping back, not stepping forward. The estate itself adds another layer. Sandringhams has long been treated as a private refuge for the royal family. It's protected by a strict no-fly zone, no drones overhead, no aerial lenses capturing who comes and goes. On the surface, that sounds like protection. In reality, it reinforces distance. He's not just downsizing, he's being repositioned. Wood Farm sits about 2 miles from Sandringham House, separated enough to feel independent, but close enough to remain within royal boundaries. It overlooks flat, open land that can feel peaceful or isolating, depending on why you're there. And this is only temporary. By April, Andrew is expected to move again, this time to Marsh Farm. That property has been described as outdated and in need of serious renovation. It's even more remote, positioned on the outer edge of the estate. Reports of moving trucks arriving at the wrong address hint at how unsettled this transition has been. He reportedly pushed for a larger property with full staff. Whether those requests were fully granted is unclear. What is clear is that this isn't Royal Lodge, and it was never meant to be. The downgrade isn't loud. There were no dramatic announcements about square footage or staffing cuts, but the shift from a 30-room mansion in Windsor to a farmhouse in rural Norfolk speaks for itself. This wasn't framed as punishment. It didn't need to be. And within days of arriving, the first signs of how different life would look began to surface. The first thing people noticed wasn't Andrew. It was a grocery van. Just 4 days after that midnight move, a Waitrose delivery truck was spotted pulling up to Wood Farm. It stayed for around 15 minutes, then rolled back out, disappearing down the estate roads like it had done this 100 times before. And on paper, that sounds normal, even boring. But that's the point. This is a man who, until days ago, lived in a mansion with household staff, controlled entrances, and a lifestyle built around never needing to be seen doing ordinary things. Now, the most visible sign of his new life is a supermarket delivery. That single detail raised a bigger question almost immediately. how much of his old setup is even left. Because Andrew didn't just lose a home, he lost the structure that came with it, the staff, the routine, the quiet insulation that made life feel untouchable even when the headlines were brutal. And Wood Farm doesn't work like that. It's tucked away, isolated, and surrounded by land that feels more like countryside than royalty. One reporter who visited the area described being hit by the smell of wetlands and agriculture, the kind of place that feels peaceful when you choose it and suffocating when you don't. Then came the sighting that answered the one question people kept asking since the move was first rumored: the corgis. Protection officers were photographed walking two dogs near Wood Farm, Muick and Sandy, the late Queen's corgis. After her passing, Andrew and Sarah Ferguson took them in, and they'd been living quietly at Royal Lodge ever since. For weeks, people speculated what would happen to them once Andrew was forced out. Now we know. The dogs are with him. And that detail matters more than it seems, because those corgis are one of the last visible links Andrew still has to the Queen, not the institution, not the palace, the person. But here's the strange part. Even with all this attention, Andrew himself still wasn't seen. Not entering the property, not leaving it, not walking the dogs, not even a blurry photo near a gate. Just protection officers, grocery deliveries, and two corgis exploring the estate like they'd already accepted the new reality. And that's where this story starts to feel less like a move and more like quiet containment. Because Sandringham has something Windsor doesn't: a no-fly zone, no drones, no aerial shots, no easy tracking. On the surface, it's perfect for privacy, but privacy cuts both ways. It doesn't just hide him from the public, it isolates him from the world. And while Andrew stayed out of sight, the people living nearby were already reacting, and not everyone was happy about their new neighbor. The move to Norfolk didn't just shrink Andrew's address, it shrank his circle. For nearly 3 decades after their divorce, Andrew and Sarah Ferguson maintained one of the most unusual arrangements in modern royal history. Separate lives on paper, shared roof in reality. They called it practical, they called it family, and for years it worked. Through scandals, lawsuits, public backlash, and health scares, Sarah stayed physically close. Royal Lodge remained their shared base. Whatever the headlines said, the image inside those gates was steady. That steadiness is now gone. Sarah is not relocating to Wood Farm. She isn't preparing to move into Marsh Farm when renovations are complete. Instead, she's reportedly looking at independent living options, weighing properties and mapping out a chapter that doesn't include cohabitation. And that shift is bigger than it sounds. Because for Andrew, Royal Lodge wasn't just a home, it was the last place where his old world still existed. And inside that world, Sarah was constant. Now she's choosing distance. Sources describe it as natural progression, a fresh start, independence. But timing matters. This isn't happening in isolation. It's happening at the exact moment Andrew's status inside the royal structure has narrowed to almost nothing. And this time, there's no shared front, no joint defense, no familiar routine, no quiet partnership behind closed doors. This isn't a dramatic split with public statements or emotional interviews. It's quieter than that, which somehow makes it louder, because the one person who remained physically beside him through every controversy is no longer under the same roof. And as Andrew settles into Wood Farm, adjusting to deliveries and silence, Sarah is stepping into something new. That contrast says more than any official announcement ever could. But none of this, not the farmhouse, not the separation, would have happened if one moment hadn't reignited everything all over again. For a long time, it looked like Andrew was going to outlast the pressure. Royal Lodge wasn't just a home, it was a foothold, a symbol that, no matter how ugly the headlines got, he still had a place inside royal territory, and he clung to it. Behind the scenes, the standoff had been building for years. King Charles wanted him out. The reasons were obvious: cost, optics, and the constant risk that Andrew's name would drag the monarchy back into controversy again. And yet Andrew kept finding ways to hold the line. He had a long lease, he had agreements in place. When financial support was reportedly reduced, he still didn't move. When security funding became a public question, he still didn't move. At one point, reports suggested he had secured private funding to keep Royal Lodge running, almost like a final act of defiance. For a moment, it looked like he'd won. Then everything changed. Because the one thing Andrew couldn't survive wasn't another rumor, it was documentation. New Epstein-related material resurfaced, the kind of information that doesn't fade after a news cycle. It doesn't matter how carefully it's worded or how many times it's explained away. Once it's in black and white, it becomes permanent. And the public reaction wasn't mild this time. It reignited the outrage in a way that felt immediate and brutal, like the story had snapped back into place after years of slowly fading. That's when Charles made the decision Andrew couldn't fight. Andrew's remaining titles were removed, and that wasn't just humiliation, it was leverage. Because titles aren't only ceremonial, they act like armor, they create distance, they make certain things harder to do, harder to enforce, harder to push through quietly. Once that armor was gone, the balance shifted instantly. The palace no longer needed to negotiate, it didn't need to wait, and Andrew no longer had the same protections that had kept him planted at Royal Lodge. The eviction wasn't just possible now, it was inevitable. And the speed of what happened next is what makes this whole situation feel so chilling. 1 month he was still resisting, still entrenched, still holding on to the last piece of the old world. Then suddenly he was leaving in the middle of the night. No cameras, no statement, no dignity. Just a car heading toward Norfolk and a farmhouse waiting in silence. And once that door closed behind him, the message was unmistakable. This wasn't about relocating, this was about containment. And now the question isn't what Andrew lost, it's what happens next. Because if more documents surface, this exile might not be the end of the story. It might be the beginning of the final unraveling. So now the real question is this: is this fair punishment for a man whose controversies have haunted the monarchy for years? Or is it the palace doing what it always does, quietly removing the problem until the public stops looking? Because if another batch of documents surfaces, if another round of revelations drops, Andrew won't have Royal Lodge to retreat behind. He'll already be out there, already isolated, already removed from the center of the story. And that might be exactly what the palace wants. Now I want to hear what you think. Is this exile overdue, or has the royal family gone too far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, the behind-the-scenes moves, the quiet decisions, and the royal moments nobody explains publicly, make sure you like this video and subscribe, because this situation is far from over.